The cool thing about archetypes in the current time, and I think why they're becoming so popular, is because they are indeed a universal language. I have called archetypes the genome of the soul. It's what connects us all on a soul level. We know about genetics and how we're all connected that way, but on a soul level, what is the common language that we all share? And it is indeed archetypes, because you can go anywhere in the world and present an archetype in a culture to a person and observe it. So, for instance, we can take mother, warrior, lover. These archetypes will express themselves individually and culturally differently. But that's what makes it interesting. What they have in common is what interests me, which is what is the deeper connection that makes them the same, so that we can all recognize them on some deep level as existent in our psyches.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I hope you are excellent. If you've ingested any of my content in the past, chances are you know that I am deeply fascinated by archetypes. In fact, I just did a whole exploration on the topic via Carl Jung, the collective unconscious, and the archetypes that live there. So yes, it is a topic that really gets my wonder dander up. And in this mind meld, my friends, I am excited to say we have a real scholar and practitioner of archetypal theory, Dr. Laurence Hillman. He holds a Ph.D. in psychology. He's the author of Planets in Play, and he's the co-creator of Archetypes at Work, a method to assess and develop people and organizations based on archetypal theory that aims to, in Lawrence's words, re-insoul the workplace, I think he says, which, my God, what a steep and noble hill to climb. I also definitely have to note that Laurence is the son of someone who's been a pretty massive influence on my own personal philosophy, the late psychologist and author James Hillman. So this is kind of a surreal mind meld in that respect. So given that this topic really runs in his blood, as he puts it at one point in this conversation, he was pretty much marinated in archetypes from a very young age. Another thing I must mention about said archetypal brining is that Laurence is a master astrologer. And I'll be honest, astrology is a topic that I'm careful about approaching. I've never really done a deep dive on the topic because it is such a polarizing one. And it's not that I'm totally, by any means, closed down to the topic. I just want to make sure that I had the conversation with the right person. And my God, Laurence Hillman is a fabulous representative emissary of that art of astrology. He was also kind enough to do a reading for me, and I definitely still have not fully digested or downloaded it. I think I will be, and just making sense of it in general, indefinitely. So much territory covered in this mind meld, so many novelty nuggets unearthed. I'm not even going to try to rattle off a laundry list of topics we get into in this conversation. We get into all of the above, everything I've mentioned, and much more. This one was really special to me. So let's just get on the ride. Let's just pierce the membrane of this mind meld. All of the applicable portals for Laurence Hillman will be in the description. Do me a favor, stop and tickle the algorithm with a like and a sub. That is, of course, the nutrition that this media entity requires to mature. Also, if you enjoy these mythopoetic musings, we've got over 300 more in audio-only form that will never be posted to video here. So do look up Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts and click subscribe. And if you want to go a layer deeper, if you want to initiate yourself into our Wonder Lodge, crowd sponsor Third Eye Drops over on Patreon. Like I said, you can join the community there and support the show, and you get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We do live gatherings, a book club, all at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, I am so excited for this one. So without further ado, let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful, whimsical Laurence Hillman. It's always challenging when you're going into a conversation that you know is going to be deep the very deep mind, where to start. And I think a good place to start would just be with what I think is going to run through this whole mind meld, which is archetypes. And, this idea that I think people like you and I probably approach it from as it's presented by Jung as this dimension of psyche that is deep, deep below the conscious mind, where the core foundational symbols that we use to make sense of the world emanate from. And what that means, how you think about it. Um, so yeah, I'll leave that ball in the air since I've already introduced you, started philosophically rambling, and I'll let you uh, do your magic with the ball, as it were.
Well, Michael, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. You know, um, I think the cool thing about archetypes in the current time, and I think why they're becoming so popular, is because they are indeed a universal language. I have called the archetypes the genome of the soul.
Mm.
It's what connects us all on a soul level. We know about genetics and how we're all connected that way, but on a soul level, what is the common language that we all share? And it is indeed archetypes, because you can go anywhere in the world and present an archetype in a culture to a person and observe it. So, for instance, we can take mother, warrior, lover, sovereign. These archetypes will express themselves individually and culturally differently. But that's what makes it interesting. What they have in common is what interests me, which is what is the deeper connection that makes them the same? What are the universal principles and ideas that lie beneath them that give them this universality so that we can all recognize them on some deep level as existent in our psyches?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about this realm of the collective unconscious or this dimension, I imagine and to an extent, I know this is impenetrable, it's unanswerable. I think Jung himself said that we can only know of its existence through working backwards, right? Because it's like we see their downstream effects. And if you try to trace those downstream effects back to their root, you get to this central point of mystery where, to your point, you see these things existing throughout cultures, manifesting in different ways but noticeably similar ways. So you're left with the conclusion, or I guess the open-ended curiosity that puts you in this space of, this concept seems to exist. It seems to exist, whether it's as an endemic feature of the human psyche or it's a priori of the human psyche. It seems to exist. But
Mhm.
I would imagine, from what I know about you, you must take this notion of their existence to be pretty literal, in a sense, like that there really are these ontological locuses of archetypal energy or consciousness. How do you think about it? Do you am I mischaracterizing you there?
I think we can never see an archetype. We can never measure an archetype, but what we can measure or see or recognize is its manifestation,
Yeah.
its embodiment. And I have a lecture that I call Venus in a Chocolate Mousse. It's one of my lines. So to me, when a waiter is kind enough to put a beautiful chocolate mousse in front of me, I see the archetype of Venus in that. It's seduction, it's beauty, it's sweetness, it's delicious, it's all of those things that we all have our own personal responses to it, but it is an archetypal energy to me. So I see the whole world like that. So whatever I'm looking at, whoever I'm talking to, I think archetypally. I'm constantly using what I call my archetypal eye to see the world. It makes it a lot of fun and quite interesting to me, and it's a way to read what's going on beneath the obvious and beneath the surface. So it's an in-depth look at things, and not
Yeah.
just look, also feel and embodiment.
I love that. It makes it so practical. Here I am getting huge and philosophical and borderline masturbatory with my question, and you just bring it right down to earth with a really practical example. And I love that. I mean, of course, the energy of a chocolate mousse would be this Venus like energy of decadence and richness and love. And I do really think that that helps make sense of the world, and that's one of my core preoccupations all the time, is in a world that seems really chaotic and like we have no real anchor spiritually. What are some of these principles we can return to that will begin to recenter us? And to me, it just seems like this idea of archetypes is a great ground floor to go to, because it doesn't require that you make any ontological statements about reality. It just requires that you recognize, hey, these are real. Like these foundational concepts are real to the human experience, and even if they're just psychological, that really gives you a certain stable footing to operate from, and that in itself is incredibly practical.
And I just want to be clear that, we live in a multicultural world. So your and my reference would be Venus, because
Hmm.
that's our culture and that's the name of the planet that is behind it from an astrological perspective. But in other cultures, there are different words for Venus, and there are different ways that the archetype appears. It's a shorthand. But if you go to Africa or you go to South America, you go somewhere else, you might find different words. You will find different words. But the archetype is recognized. So part of the curiosity then on your journeys becomes to find out, how do other cultures, how do other people experience, express, and imagine that archetype? Just because I call it Venus, that's a shortcut for me.
Hmm.
But the experience is still universal. Those experiences of seduction, of beauty, of longing, of desire, of sweetness, all of those are universal. And so my curiosity when I travel is to find out. I always understand the archetype, but I want to know how it's then translated upwards into culture and people
Yeah,
from this deep place where it exists and
totally. Oh,
informs.
sorry.
Archetypes inform. They essentially inform, people, behavior, objects, everything. So they're an underlying pattern that exists. And so if we can read them, we can understand things much better on a much deeper level.
Yeah. You know what really just struck me in an almost like micro epiphany kind of way when you were talking there is the way ancient cultures used to approach gods versus this like locked down dogmatic way that we tend to approach them in a modern sense, where seemingly, from what I understand, they were seeking a kind of syncretism. The Egyptians and the Greeks liked when they and the Romans liked when they would come together and say, aha, your Mercury is our Hermes, your Thoth is our Hermes, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some equivalency in these concepts. The way that you were just outlining it makes that make so much more sense, because this stupid modern notion that we would argue about what's the correct name of a god to put over, to use your example, chocolate mousse. Like, who cares about the name? It's understanding the symbol system and its roots, and just putting a name like Venus over it helps you get there if you understand the mythological genealogy of that idea. Then it makes sense. And I think that that's something that we lose, one of the many things we lose when we think about gods in this really oddly reductionist way, where it's like like we live in a world that at most allows for one god. At most there is a god or there's not a god. Like that seems to be the way that we think about.
Well, it's
um
literalism. We
right.
live in a literal time, and so it's hard to make these richer analogies. I like your referring back to, cultural mutual interests and understanding, and your Mercury is my is my Hermes, and these kind of ideas. I'm not sure it was quite that elegant and not just stealing, but still, it is a way of longing to understand. I think we lost a lot of that with Inquisition and with the whole sort of conquering of the world that happened, in the 18th, well, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Just
Yeah.
going out and conquering and then killing all the local structures and imposing Christianity in so many parts of the world took away that conversation of what is here, what are the origins. We're now trying to recover a lot of that all over the world, but part of that notion of our God is better than your God takes away that richness of multiplicity that we had globally and that is still available to us, of course, and it still exists in some parts of the world.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and it's leading to this lack of mythopoetic fluency
Hmm.
that I think is really robbing us of that more connected spiritual way of being, because when you don't have that language, things don't seem magical. Things don't seem like they have this deeper root in something meaningful and connected and playful and dramatic and romantic anymore. It's just like it's just stuff. There's no essence beyond the stuff. If I can't weigh it, I can't measure it empirically, then it's not really real. And if you live in that kind of a world, it's just this. I mean, unless you're the type of person who's super analytical and you get off on that kind of um, complexity, it just seems like a world that's robbed of its essence or something.
Absolutely. Well, I think at our core, we are meaning making creatures. I do believe that no matter how you put it, we look for lots of different ways and have forever looked for ways to make meaning of things and people and ourselves and our stories. And, when you get to a completely materialistic existence, you cut off such a big part of yourself that people then go to extremes to make to have some kind of meaning making. They look for isms, or they look for clear rules about what makes
Right.
sense to them. And I mean, just think about it. When you buy, when you're totally materialistic, if something has no meaning except that it's a satisfier for a short moment, like an object or something you buy because it's the thing or because you want it right now, think about how quickly we lose interest in our presents when we get them and things like that. It's just it doesn't last because it has no meaning.
Yeah.
But if it does have meaning because so and so gave it to us, then it suddenly becomes this hugely rich object for us.
Yeah.
Or this thing from our childhood, or this, somebody saved, a lock from our childhood. It has this huge meaning because we've imbued it with the gods, with richness, with an archetypal value, and that's what makes life meaningful and important. Otherwise, it's just a bane existence of consumerism, which is where so many people live and are suffering because there is no meaning making mechanism anymore. So they're the huge resurgence of astrology at this time is clearly because people are trying to make sense. You mean I fit into the universe in some way? I'm actually part of something larger. I'm not just a random existence here. you know, for many, many, God has left the picture. And so it's no longer about religion. It's about trying to make meaning in some way. So there's all these new ways that people are trying to find some kind of pattern where they fit in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to make our perilous, wonderful journey into the A word that you just brought up, because I
Mhm.
know that you're really a renowned, as far as I'm concerned, a renowned expert on that topic and practitioner of that art. But one thing I wanted to bring up before I forget is a weird relation to your idea of Venus being in chocolate mousse. There's a book. Have you by chance read the book Immortality Key?
No.
I think you would love it.
Mhm.
It is written by a guy who is a classicist, speaks ancient languages, um, and he set out to essentially investigate the famous mystery cult of Eleusis.
Mhm.
And one of his motivations was to try to exonerate this professor named I believe it's Ruck. I don't want to get this wrong, but from Boston College. He and a couple other people proposed essentially that at the cult of Eleusis there was some well, we know that there was a beverage called the Kaikion that was like the entryway to the great mystery, and you ritualistically drank this beverage. And Ruck hypothesized that there was a psychedelic component to this beverage, and that you would go into an altered state of communing with the goddess. That, all of these great people throughout antiquity um, spoke so highly of. People like Plato, I think Herodotus. There's so many. Like there's so many that it almost like it's pretty much any name that you can think of from that era probably was initiated at some point. But one of the things that really changed my understanding of their ideas of gods versus our ideas of gods is that gods were something that you would directly experience, not in a way of like um where we're sort of trying to dialogue with something higher, but we would literally take the god into our bodies and experience the god. So he also talks about like the Dionysian cult and the Maenads, and they, when you read the text, it's very clear that they believed they were taking Dionysus into their body through the wine, and they would
Absolutely.
go into this altered state where they would they would merge with this Dionysian archetype through the wine. And that's just something that it's
Well,
maybe it's a small difference, but I think it's such a
it's
profound,
a
interesting
huge
difference.
difference. It's a profound difference. The model that I use to understand the world and the people I work with is based on embodiment completely. It is that we actually step into these parts of ourselves, these multiple gods that are within us. And funny enough, in Christianity, it is repeated again and again and again that you are made in the image of God. You are, Jesus is in you. It's that kind of a thing. Meanwhile, most of us think of Jesus as up on the cross and separate from us, and we worship what's up there, and we pray to, and we ask for forgiveness, and it's all about a distant relationship that we try to make closer. It's very, very different from what it actually is teaching, which is, hey, it's in you, and it's behaving Christ-like, which is the idea, not to sort of try to emulate someone else. And so, or I mean, worship someone else, or that it's already within us, the potential to do that. So, in a very similar manner, um, without that whole worshiping part, I believe that the gods are within us because these archetypes are within us, and that we can step into them at any moment. So, you have these inner archetypes that we just talked about. For instance, take the lover. um, you know, the lover is not only in the Venus mousse. I mean, in a chocolate mousse, Venus in the chocolate mousse, but the lover is also in us when we go on a date, or when we dress nice, or when we put on some perfume, or when we do our hair, or when we love to count our money, or when we are in politics and have to be diplomatic. All of those moments, the same archetype is showing up in different variations of that archetype. Archetypes are very rich. So if we can recognize that, we can see who's present, who has stepped forward in that moment in the space, in the person, in the environment, in the music, in the smells. So we can recognize the archetype as being present anywhere at any time when we develop this archetypal eye.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
we hear it and feel it and see it, and it is incredibly personal, and it's also incredibly reflected in what we see.
Yeah. I think that's so indisputable, especially once you equip yourself with what I was saying before, with that, like a little bit of that mythopoetic fluency. I think you just see it in yourself. You see it in everything. When I was drinking my coffee this morning, I was thinking to myself, I wish I knew more about the brain and hormones, because if I did, I bet you there are some mythopoetic connections that would really set off epiphanies, like perhaps in other people, but definitely in myself, from the standpoint of like hormones themselves seem archetypal. Like testosterone is a low hanging fruit one, right? Like that's Mars, that's warrior energy. Like, and then there's serotonin, there's oxytocin, that a very Venus like energy. And like that, there could be something to of an Olympus, literally physically in your brain, in a way that people don't think about.
Absolutely. And that has been, I have a book from the 1930s, I believe, from a medical doctor who wrote it's a fabulous thick book that talks about connects the planets and body parts and functions.
Mm.
And it's just fun to read, even from the medicines, how things were looked at then that we now know so much more about medically. And yes, that's true. And I think it's a mindset. How much do we need to know? So if you go back and you go to Delphi and you say, well, there were gases that coming out of the ground, and so everybody was stoned essentially,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
if you have, if it's sort of like, see, they're not doing anything weird, they're just doing this. It's just,
Right.
I can explain it with my left brain scientific mind. Now I feel good about myself, because it's so scary that maybe there is no explanation that I can fathom with my left brain ability, that I'm now freaked out. That's fine. That's a person's mindset. I just need to be sure that we recognize the limitations of that mindset, because it closes off a whole lot of things. It's a little bit, to me, like going into um, to a concert and hearing Beethoven's Fifth playing, but being only concerned with the space between the notes. That's what the intervals is what interests me, not the sound. And so it doesn't mean it's wrong. I'll give you a very quick analogy. So just so we understand how people show up in the world, it's kind of a clear distinction in how people approach things. Sure, there are people in between, but just as a general story, I think of two, let's say, two young girls who have lived all their life in a village in China. They've never been outside of their village. They speak only Chinese, and somebody invites them to Broadway to go see a show. And they're sitting in the front row, and their eyes are this big, and they're looking at this extraordinary scenario that's happening. So the one girl is really interested in the curtains going up and down and the things moving around on the stage, and she can see behind and see people running around and pulling ropes and pushing buttons and levers and all kinds of things. And she's fascinated in what's going on and the mechanics of this whole thing. It's her engineering mind is just really excited. The other one is trying to figure out what the story is about.
Yeah.
Neither of them is right or wrong, but they're two different perspectives. I often use that analogy. The first one is the astronomer who wants to know how fast things move and how what the mass weight is and so forth of the planets. The other ones who know what they mean, the astrologer. So neither one of them is right or wrong, but they have equal value because they just have different perspectives. That's the key for me.
Yeah.
And so, and you can argue with, well, how do you know what something means? But then you have to actually deepen yourself a little bit into astrology to be able to answer that, just like you have to deepen yourself into astrophysics if you want to answer, astronomy. So I just think that's important, that we understand where a person is coming from. There's no right or wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong kind of a thing. It's being aware of, my father used to say, be aware of what tree you're sitting in.
Yes, I
You know,
love that whole riff. I know that riff. I love that riff. Yeah.
it's
Please,
just
please
really,
share it. Yeah.
yeah, it's that it matters because it's perspective. Essentially, that's it. What tree are you sitting in, and how are you recognizing your own thinking, because so few people do. And that's self-awareness, which to me is the beginning of any conversation. If it's just attack or just denial or just pushing back or just, it gets really boring. So I don't get into arguments with people about the validity of astrology. I'm like, have you tried it? It's the famous line of Newton. He said to one of his fellows, he was an astrologer, and he said to one of his fellow scientists, I have tried it and you have not. So basically, shut up. It's like,
Right.
that was his comment, which is not necessarily the best way to go about it. But there's something clear about that. It's like, give it a shot, try it out. And it's like someone explaining why love is not right, who has never been in love. I'm not going to listen to them. It's boring.
Yeah.
It's mind games.
It really is. And yeah, I love that point that knowledge is not mutually exclusive. It's not either this mythopoetic way of seeing or a literal analytical
Right.
way of seeing. It really is like uh, two two POVs. What's that famous um the famous analogy about the elephant where it's like the blind man's like feeling
Yeah,
different parts of the
exactly.
elephant.
Right.
Yeah.
No one can ever see the whole one, exactly. And yeah, it's not about right and wrong is the point. It's just being aware of our own perspective. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it
And to
is.
be interested in the other perspective. I love science. I have a engineering master's. I love science. I have no problem with science. And I get it. And astrology has a lot of science in it. We have to calculate. I remember in the '70s doing using tables and spending 4 hours calculating a chart that's now done by a computer. I love all of that. I love the scientific part, but that to me means I have a well-developed left brain and I can think practically and linearly if I have to. But I also want to enjoy, who wants to live with only half their brain?
Right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
To an extent, we need it, and I'm with you on that. If I'm, although I am very attracted to this mythopoetic way of seeing, believe me, I am allergic to bullshit. And when I sense that there's nothing propping up some idea or there's dubious origins to some idea, I want to know and I want to dig. And if I don't feel like there's anything of substance there, I'm not interested.
exactly.
Like we need to exercise critical thinking when it comes to these ideas, especially if we feel really just drawn and naturally biased towards certain ideas. Like I say this all the time, I don't want to live in a cold, dead, meaningless universe. Therefore, I know that I might be primed to want to connect to some of these ideas. So I need to maintain that critical eye on them and myself and why I'm attracted to things, because it may be that it's just, oh, whew, I'm not alone. It might be my reaching at times. So I have to be aware of that, and I think everybody has to be aware of that in their own way. Maybe they have the opposite disposition. Maybe I know so many people, and I'm sure you do too, that came from some kind of really dogmatic religious background, and as soon as you bring up anything remotely spiritual, you can like feel them start to quiver and clench their orify, and they're like, I don't, no, no, and
It's scary, but that's right. But that's a dogma. That's an
yeah,
ism. It's just as much an ism as somebody who is in the scientific mindset and just cannot think outside of what can be measured.
yeah,
And so neither of them is right or wrong. But again, what might help these people is to just be aware that from their perspective, they're missing a whole bunch of other perspectives and that's not a threat. Multi-perspectival ability is one of the main things we need today. And you also mentioned the other one that I think is the main skill set going forward for human beings to really learn in the age of Aquarius for me. And that's a whole other conversation. But for me, the main skill set we have to now learn and develop well is discernment.
yes,
It's the number one thing because so much BS is coming our way all the time from so many directions that we have to learn essentially how to become fact checkers and how to really let things sink in and see if they resonate with us or if it's just something that someone else has pre-chewed for us and these kind of things. That takes discernment. That's a skill set that we're not very good at, and that is going to be the primary required skill in my mind to make it through the next 100 years.
yeah. I think discernment and as well as just being ready to be flexible, because, and I think this fits in with the Aquarian sort of ethos or dynamic as well, in that we were talking about this, I think, privately a little bit, that people just don't want to be put in boxes anymore, and our ideas about, well, things are this way, and I'm not quite comfortable with that idea. Like, you better get comfortable,
Right.
because it's just going
Okay.
to get weirder. The boundaries are going to get blurrier. It seems like that is for sure on the rise.
Yeah, one of the ways I'm getting ready for this new age, as we're sort of already in many ways, but not fully yet, probably. There's no switch that gets flipped and suddenly we're in a new age. That takes a while to make the transition. As Ray Grassi so beautifully says, it's called the dawning of the age of Aquarius. When is it dawn? When you see the first rays of the sun, or when the sun is above the horizon. So it's a period that we're definitely in. And one of the ways I'm getting ready for that is by literally in my own private life embracing change as much as I can. So any habits that I have, anything that I'm comfortable with, I tend to challenge regularly. Yeah, I've done that. Don't need to do that, and let's do something different with that. And it's always a little bit, dis, you know, difficult. And then when I do it, it feels freeing because I'm sort of going with the flow of what's going on in the world, and that's much easier than when there is actual change that happens. Oh, I thought this was this way. Oh, I guess it's not. It's this way. It's like, yeah, it's like that muscle has been trained. So I can practice my own muscle because I know things are only going to change way, way, way more than from what I've known. So all the unknown can be embraced or it can be shunned and pushed back against. But the unknown is emerging. and it is happening really fast. Think of chat gpt, and we don't have the
Oh
tools. Remember when we had cloning come up, and everybody, we don't have the
yeah.
ethical tools to deal with cloning. What if we could clone a human being? Then what? Where does it end? And so these kind of things, as science advances really quickly, we need, in my mind, mythopoetic tools to see all the surface stuff that's bubbling really quickly on a deeper level that we can resonate with, that we can understand, which is the archetypal level. And because that's in us already. And with that, we can understand all these changes, and it makes perfect sense. And we can even enjoy them because we're part of it. And it's not out there. It's not something we're either worshiping or hating. It's something that we actually can personally experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so with you, and I love the way that you just laid all of that out. And now I think, Lawrence, it's time to go there. It's time to go into the realm that you are such an expert in, that I am so curious about, that I've actually, I'll be honest with you, I think I've avoided conversations about astrology too much on the show because I was waiting for the right person to really have that conversation with. And you're without a doubt that person. I knew that before you even did my reading, but then after you did my reading, I was like, yeah, this is the man that I want to have this conversation with.
Well,
And,
thank you. That's very, very generous of you to
thank
say that.
thank you. Thank you.
So, do you have a specific question? You want me to just riff?
Yeah.
How would you
Well,
like?
yeah. I think so. Anybody who is listening, like just creating some simulacrum outline of a skeptical person who has a knee jerk negative rejection of that idea. And I think where I think the chasm that most that those people can't cross is they see everything we're talking about so far in that these archetypes, whether they're ontologically real or just psychologically real, that they seem to exist. But then there's this chasm between them existing within us and the planetary bodies, celestial bodies having some kind of actual influence on us.
Okay.
And for you, how did you initially? How did it click for you? And how did you initially cross that chasm, if you can remember?
Yeah, I can remember. I can remember like it was the first, like it happened yesterday. I was 16, and my mother was interested in astrology. I was kind of bored in school, and we had a family friend whom I'd known since I was a little boy, who was an astrologer. And she said, "Hey," because she liked it. She said, "Hey, why don't you go spend some time studying astrology with him?" I'm like, "Okay, whatever." I was 16. So I got on my little moped, went down the hill, and knocked on his door and said, "Hey," he says, "You want astrology?" I said, "Yeah, I guess." So I literally sat at his feet because he had a small place. So I sat on the floor, and then he was sitting in a chair. And 10 minutes into my first lesson with him, I knew with a absolute clarity, this is what I'm going to do all my life. And that was 46 years ago.
Wow.
It's never changed. And it was a recognition like, oh, yeah, I guess, maybe I've done it in a past life. Who knows? Doesn't really matter. But it felt incredibly familiar. But what interested me, why I got caught, was by what it can do, the what its capacity, the capacity of what astrology actually can do, which is to map out these archetypes. So I was talking before about that we have these inner archetypes, and maybe people agree with that, but they don't want to go as far as connecting to the planets. So then I asked the question, all right, so what if there was a way that we could actually map out these inner archetypes? And so there's different ways we can do that. We can do that by just describing a person's talents, for instance, and saying, well, this painter, clearly the way she paints has all these beautiful figures and colors and landscapes that she paints. There has to be a strong, Venusian in our language archetype, right? There, that's present in her. She has easy access to that part of herself, and she uses it on a daily basis. Cool. Or somebody who's, James Earl Jones famously is well known in the world for his voice. So probably there's a strong storyteller or Mercury, present in his psyche that he has easy access to. And then I would be curious about. So that's the way one could start to map these, a little bit sort of. It's a little bit like somebody, if you break your arm and you go to a good doctor, you know they can probably set your arm pretty well by just
Hmm.
feeling what's going on and bandaging it up, and it'll probably grow together pretty straight. But what if you had a tool to actually look at the bone structures and how they've broken or what's going on in there, that which we would call an X-ray? There is such a tool, and it's called, a person's personal chart. That is that precise. Now, can I say that with surety? Absolutely, because I've seen it for 46 years, thousands of times, to be extraordinarily accurate. There's no way that a rational, causal thinking mind can explain the experiences that people have when they get a reading that cannot be explained through the left brain. They just can't. Now, some of those things happen in therapy as well, or they happen
Hmm.
when someone is, in love. They happen in other places where archetypes become very, very strong. But you have a blueprint, you have a way to look at that is incredibly useful. So I look at it from a totally utilitarian perspective. If there's a tool that I can use to apply to actually map out a person's archetypes, where they are really comfortable with an archetype, where they're less comfortable with an archetype, where they could develop an archetype because it would help them to not be walked over all the time. So maybe they want to develop their warrior so that they can stand up for themselves, or these kinds of things. Or maybe they feel they're too sensitive, and every time someone says something mean, they fall apart. And so how would that help them to
Yeah.
build up their, in other words, it's a developmental tool. It's a psychological developmental tool, but we need the map first so we know where a person is. That you can see, a trained eye can look at a map of a person's um, birth chart and see those things in a split second. So it's a little bit like, um, suppose we found a brand new piece of music from Beethoven that was hidden in someone's attic. It's never been found before, right? And you're a composer, or you're a conductor. I mean, you would freak out with excitement. You see
Yeah.
that, you would see these black dots on a white piece of paper and some lines, and you would hear the whole thing in your head and get incredibly excited. That's how I feel every time I look at a chart. I'm looking at black dots and lines on a white piece of paper, and it speaks to me the same way it would to a composer or to a conductor, a new piece of Beethoven work. It's a new piece. I've never seen this chart before, and it's really exciting. So it tells a story. It's music. But it's a right brain story. So um, now you might say, okay, well, how is that possible? Or, the left brainer is going to go, well, wait a minute, how is that possible? What do the planets have to do with anything? The first thing I want to think about is the word influence. Influence literally comes from astrology. It comes from Latin influere, the idea that planets are flowing into us. That's
Hmm.
actually where the word comes from. So do other words like disaster, literally means disaster, which means this is disconnected from the stars. So there's some lovely, lovely, astrological
Okay.
terminology in our language. But influence to me is not the way to think about the planets. So I don't believe that the planets influence me. I don't
Hmm.
believe that, I know enough physics to know that when I'm born, the gravitational pull, if that's what I'm thinking is the influence of Pluto, is way, way, way less than the vase that's sitting on the windowsill. So no, that's not how it works. I think of it very differently. I believe, which most spiritual um, philosophies and belief systems believe, that there is really no separation, that everything is one. You can literally say that because we all came out of the Big Bang, and so everything at one point was just, an atom, and now it's everything. So everything is, or as others have said, we are indeed made of stardust because
Right.
that's what we are. So if that's true, if there is just a oneness, then this is one large system, one giant system. We have little thoughts about that. Quantum physics certainly starting to go there.
Yeah.
The butterfly effect speaks of that. Something happens here, something over there. So all of these, that we're starting to get into the collective consciousness that there is actually this oneness. The age of Aquarius will bring that about even more. Internet has certainly brought this idea of oneness. COVID has certainly brought this idea of oneness, that we're not really able to sort of separate ourselves from this oneness, whatever this oneness is, humanity, the world, the universe, all of it.
Yeah.
Then, once we have that idea, if that there's oneness, if we accept that idea, and that's a belief system because you could argue against it. And I'm fully aware that part of astrology is a belief system, just like science is a belief system. Even though you can prove it and repeat it, you can also prove and repeat things in astrology. So, if you want to use that logic. But so there is this oneness, and in this oneness, there's a lot of chaos that we really just don't understand. And if I want to understand something specific, like let's say human behavior, a person's behavior, which is very complex and very messy, if I want to get some structure into that, I can see this over here, but I can look over here in something that is organized and get a sense of that because it's part of the same system. So what's going on here is going on there as well. It's a parallel thinking, or what's called synchronistic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So, where is there some structure in this chaos of oneness? The only thing I would argue that is completely and absolutely and totally predictable always is the position of the planets. There's nothing else you can really know, but I can tell you exactly where Mars is going to be in reference to the Earth in 37.5698 years.
Yeah.
Science. So we know certain things. So we know structures, we know cycles, we know how long it takes planets to go around the sun. We know all of these things. So we have a very, very, very structured, which is why, by the way, all calendars have always been set around heavenly bodies, sun and moon, throughout the ages, because that gives us some order in this chaotic world of ours.
Yeah. Beautifully
So
explained.
we've used the planets for that. So just to finish, so we can use that, we can look at patterns in the planets if we understand their meaning, which is a different conversation. But if we understand their meaning, we can look at those patterns and then understand what's going on in a person at that, at any given moment, because those patterns are reflected in that person. And then, so the first idea is as above, so below, which
Yeah.
is the old axiom of what's happening in the sky is also happening on the earth. And the second idea in astrology, there's two key ideas. First one is that one, that you believe that or you don't. And the second one is that of the acorn, that, why is the minute of birth so important? Because the whole oak tree is already in the acorn. Same thing is all of your potential, everything that can be on this archetypal level, not literally. It doesn't give you the name of who you're going to marry, but it's going to give you a potential of how you approach marriage. And so that's going to be in the acorn. Now, we know there's such a thing as nurture. So we know it's not just nature, not just how you're born and what sky you're born under, but as that tree grows to be 3 foot high, a deer comes by and eats off a branch. I have no idea if deers eat oak, but let's pretend they do. And so that branch isn't going to grow, but something else is going to grow more. We know that from biology. So there is this there is this real life nurturing of this tree that is going to shape it in a certain way. But the potential of everything, I'm not just talking about its genetics, I'm talking about things like its treeness, its beauty, its ability to give shade. All of these things are already in the acorn. That's the lovely thing. And that's what you can read in a person. It doesn't matter if they're 2 years old or if they're 92 years old. You can read that story that's in a person, that poetic story. And that can be very valuable because now we're right back to where we started today, Michael, which is this gives a person meaning to actually have a place in the universe and their own story that is actually sense making out of
Yeah.
this seeming, chaos.
Masterfully explained. Masterfully explained. And you reached into some of my very favorite bags subtly. The as above, so below. We're getting into Hermeticism, the acorn. You're getting into not only your father, but the work of Plato before that, and the way the Greeks thought of people as this paradigma, this pre-established pattern by the fates, where the threads of their fate was already formed at birth to an extent. And that doesn't mean you have no free will, but it means this is the avatar you have to play the game of life with, and this is your situation. And to your point, like, the at most you have to suspend disbelief, because there are things that happen to us all the time that are, whether we're even aware of them or not, sometimes we're more aware or less aware, things are happening that are incredibly synchronistic, are incredibly interwoven in ways that we don't understand. And there are moments in your life where that happens in a really undeniable way, where all kinds of things line up. And you have to, if you're a thinking person and you're weighing both options equally, either something incredibly statistically unlikely is happening to me that's equivalent to like getting struck by lightning, or there is some kind of hidden meaning in these events being exerted that I don't understand. And if you're at least willing to get to that point, then you have to hold some space for this worldview of interconnection, of Jung's idea of the unus mundus, of the Tao, of the Hermetic oneness. Take your pick of the mystical traditions talking about oneness. It's literally all of them. And if you leave some room for that, you have to at least be open to the idea that there could be something to this method. And even if you're just open to it, then I think it deserves, when you look at the preponderance of evidence, in that every single ancient culture on the planet, from my knowledge, had an astrological system. They were heavily obsessed with the night sky and understanding planetary bodies in a way that if you look at it, it almost doesn't make sense from our modern perspective, because their whole civilizations were formed around these astrologically aligned megalithic temples that would have been nearly impossible to construct, yet they exist on every single continent. So when you look at it that way, you've got to open your mind to, hmm, maybe there's more going on than science allows for. Maybe the ancients knew something we didn't, and maybe we should pay some modicum of attention to those things.
Right. And 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 the reality is that we still have innately, our, what I call in simple terms, our right brain capabilities. We all do. And it's just that they get warped, they get, so we can instead have a belief that astrology is can't be real because our other beliefs are so strong. That's a right brain problem. And because I'm Christian, I can't believe in astrology. Meanwhile, the Bible is chock full of astrology if you know where to look. Just like Shakespeare is chock full of astrology. There's books written about it. So there's astrology in everything. Like I just said, in language, the most of the days of the week are after planets. So
Mm.
it's just it's such a natural part of our thinking. It's not like this ism that is being forced upon us. If you think of science as observing nature, the simplest maybe definition of science, observing and experimenting around nature, then astrology is the oldest science that we have, because astrological measurements were done back in the Babylonian days, 5,000 years ago. There's no other science that was translated. But I think you got into the key of why it's been shunned regularly. It comes up in times, and all the nobles and the kings and the popes and everybody want astrologers in their courts, and then oops, they have too much power, let's kick them out again. This is a rising and ebbing flow, has been through history, and I think you touched on it by using the word free will. I think there's a real fear by the church that if astrologers can look into the future and do these kind of things, and we should talk about looking into the future because that's a highly contested subject too.
Mm.
But if we can do these things, where is our free will? And so, in simple terms, it looks like that. Well, astrologers predict the future, and therefore, we have no free will, and therefore, astrology is BS if I believe in free will. All of that is nonsense from my perspective. First of all, I do not believe, I have it written on my website, I do not believe that a person can predict the future, period. I don't believe you can predict the future because I believe in free will. However, what I do believe in is you can do an archetypal forecast. That means I can tell you, hey, Michael, in September, it's going to rain in your life. It's a metaphor, it's a right brain image. It's going to rain a lot. I don't know what that means for you, but I know it's going to be a rainy kind of season. That's probably not the best time to go and plant a garden. I would wait till, maybe November. However, you have a choice, because you can say, screw that. I'm going to plant a garden when I want to plant a garden. I don't care about rain. It's fine. I'll put a roof over it. I'll do something about it. Or you can say, I hate the rain. I'm going to stick my head under my blanket until it's over. Or I'm going to go out and dance around in the rain because I love the rain. Those are all choices. What you do with it, I have no idea. If I told you you would do any one of those things, that would be a prediction. But by archetypally forecasting and give you almost like a weather forecast, here's the kind of time you're going to be in. Astrology essentially is a clock that measures the quality of time, the moment,
Mm.
the kind of time that we're in, or what some people call kairos.
Yeah, it's a
As
Kairos
a-
clock. I like that.
It's a kairos clock. That's exactly what it is. And so, and we still use those words in our language. We say things like, I'm having a bad day. That's a qualitative statement about time. Or, but imagine how we've lost that ability. Imagine if you went to your boss and said, "Boss, I think we should sign this document, next Tuesday because it's a better day to sign." You'll be looked at like you're nuts because we think we're in control of time, and quantitative time is more important. Nope, this is the wrong time. Meanwhile, people understand things like Mercury retrograde. This is a time where things go weird, things like that. It's getting more and more part of our consciousness. But if we could become totally time quality conscious, we would live a very different kind of a life, because we would ask ourselves, what's the right thing to do in this moment? Not what's the right thing to do because I want to or because someone told me to, but what's the right thing to do in this moment? That would be completely receptive to synchronicities and to the time that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. All very well said. Let's dig into this concept of Kairos a little bit because
Mhm.
I think that's a really good kind of shorthand way of describing it. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way, that it's like a qualitative clock. It's a quality of time.
Mhm.
So the Greeks had this notion of two different kinds of time, Chronos and Kairos. Chronos is the more, you know, co- this happens, then this happens, sequential kind of time that we measure with a clock. And Chronos is this, it's the right time. I've heard it described as too. It's the um it's a more potent kind of time.
Right. Think about, here's a very practical example how you know someone is talking quality of time. If somebody says, "Hey, I was born in the 60s, baby." What do you immediately associate with that? Rebellious, change,
Yeah,
free
psychedelics. Yeah.
sex, free, fight the war, music revolution, all those things, because there was a certain quality in that time. So if someone is, and so we think of those. I was born in the 60s is essentially an astrological reference. That means, from an astrologer's perspective, Uranus and Pluto, the two most rebellious revolutionary planets that we know, were aligned in the 60s only once in the 20th century. And that gave us that impact that changed the whole world in so many ways. So that's an astrological sentence essentially if you have that mindset.
Yeah. Let's expand on this idea. So I think people get that. Like there is this quality to the 60s and that whole movement. What is the character and quality of the time we're in now, and where is it heading? I mean, I know to make you go against your own dictum of not being able to tell the future, but
No,
generally,
but that kind of those
yeah,
kinds of things we can ask. Those kinds
yeah,
of questions we can ask, because that's asking about the quality of the moment. You're not asking me what's going to happen. You're asking me what kind of time are we living in. It's a different question.
yeah,
And then one can very quickly imagine, based on one's own filters, what one thinks is going to happen in such times. But one can explain a lot of what's happening through this filter, through the understand the quality of the time. Okay, so um, biggest picture all the way down to short-term things that last a couple of weeks from an astrological perspective. But the biggest picture of what's going on from my perspective is this shifting of the ages, is that we're moving from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And that is maybe takes 100 years, I don't know, but it takes time. It's not a switch. And the way I know that it's happened, there's a lot of conversation, arguing, and one of the ways people try to refute astrology is by saying, "Well, you guys can't even agree on stuff." Well, have you ever heard two psychologists agree? One's in archetypal and one's developmental. Have you ever heard two medical doctors agree? Everybody has these different. Of course, there's certain key tenets you agree on, and then there's things you argue about because it's an unfolding knowledge. Of course, if it wasn't, it would be a doctrine, which would be incredibly dangerous from my perspective. It's an alive thing, just like all other isms. So that's the biggest one, and to me, that's the most significant one that I measure what's going on against to get an understanding of what's happening, because it's to me it's so obvious. There are other things. There was the U.S. Pluto return, which happens once every 248 years. There's
well,
some YouTube stuff up that where I speak to that, and many others have talked about it. Who is excellent, the brilliant genius mind on that topic of timing and of history is really Rick Tarnas, archetypal
yeah,
astrologer and philosopher and thinker. very capable. That's where I would go to answer those bigger questions. But from my perspective, the the um, the Aquarian age has a core shift in how human beings organize themselves, and that's the really biggest change that we're dealing with on the macro level. And I think of it in a very simple image. If I think of how did people organize themselves for the last many thousand years, but certainly especially for the last 2,000 years for one other reason, which is monotheism.
Hmm.
But we'll get to that. But the main structure that I think of how people have organized themselves is as a pyramid. And, at the top of the pyramid is one person, usually a man, if it's anywhere in the world. And if it's in the West, it's almost always a white man. And it's a power structure. So you can take one pope at the top down to people in the pews, one CEO at the top down to people on the line, one general at the top down to people in the trenches. Think about any structure you want, how human beings organize themselves, and you'll find that model. In that model, your job as being somewhere in the pyramid is twofold. It's to kiss up and to kick down. That's
Yeah.
the model. That's what we've been told. And we all know this. That's you polite to the adults, and you beat up the little ones. That's the idea. And that's very prevalent in every structure. It's deeply ingrained in our way. We respect authority because they have power over us. And my father would have said, as I just said before, that this is also a very monotheistic idea, because one God at the top is the same idea, down to us, mere mortals at the bottom. And so the closer we're trying to struggle to get up the pyramid, to get to become CEO, to get to be the boss, to become, higher in the position, you climb up the ladder of power, all of these things. A lot of that today, even in this conversation, start to sound really silly. They would not have sounded silly 30 years ago, or certainly not 60 years ago. That's what you did. But today, that seems really weird. Really? Why? You
Yeah.
tell a young person that, it seems wrong. So what's happening here? There's a new model out there. There's a new way that human beings are thinking about thinking about how they organize themselves. And so the image that I have for the new model, and I ask this when I teach a class, I say, so what do you think? And I get circle, sphere, I get, cylinder, I get all kinds of new kinds of ideas. I think of it as an exploded three-dimensional network, lots of dots connected all over the place. And each one of us is now a dot in this network. We are incredibly networked these days. And, the Ukrainian war even made me think about how we're also networked into physical systems like the sewer system and the electrical system and the grids that we're in. Getting off the grid is this new thing, because it's a realization, hey, we're actually in all these grids. There's electric coming into my house, there's gas, there's cable, and so on,
Yeah.
phone lines, all of that stuff. So those are all networks where you're tied into others. But of course, there's all these new social networks that are incredibly powerful, where people are connected, and we're all in family networks, and we have different groups in our Twitters and in our Instagrams and in our and so forth. We have likes, we have dislikes. We're in these groups. This is why I think discernment is the number one skill set that we have to develop, because we're being bombarded with information out of all these networks. We're in all these networks. And as a node on this network, we're getting information and have to pass it on. If we blindly pass it on, which is what most people do, that's how scams get
Yeah.
distributed very quickly, is because people say, oh, that's cool, let me share it with everybody. My favorite scam was the one where the scam itself was the fact that you pass it on. Be careful of whatever. Oh, I got to tell everybody. Well,
Yeah.
that's
Those chain
jamming
letters. Yeah.
people's inboxes was the scam itself. That really was a classic example of what I'm talking about. So discernment, learning how to do research, double sourcing things, triple sourcing things. What does a double blind study mean? What do these things mean? What does peer reviewed mean? These are really important terms
Yeah.
that people are going to have to learn to become intelligent nodes in this three-dimensional network. So it's changed a lot. But I deal with leadership. I'm a leadership coach and consultant. And one of the things I've learned is, imagine if you're leading in that model. I got an MBA in the 80s. That was, fully in the pyramid model. Most of that stuff, except for finance and some things that don't really change that much, is almost useless today. Imagine if you're a leader in that mindset. You kick down and kiss up. That's what you were trained. That's what you know how to do. And you're trying to lead in a three-dimensional matrix. You're really in a bad place. And that's why so many leaders are struggling, because they don't know what to do and how to lead in a matrix. It's a completely different skill set.
Yeah.
And that to me is a fascinating topic. How do we train leaders to be able to operate in a three-dimensional matrix or in a three-dimensional network? Use whatever term you want. To me, that is the thing. So movies like The Matrix, speaking of Matrix, really speak to this interconnectedness and being part of this whole system that we're in, that we can't um, extricate ourselves very easily. Sure, you can get off the grid, and that's part of that desire. I don't want to be in the matrix. But to me, it's also like, do you want to be part of what's happening or not? Do you want to be intelligent in this new matrix, or you want to be a victim of it and say, I'm going to get out of it? I think it's wrong to say, I'm not going to use technology. I'm going to get out of technology. It's like saying, I'm not breathing air, because right now everything is technology. So let's work with it and make the best of it. And what could it be really good for? The fact that you and I can talk across the country like this is fantastic. I think that's super cool. So I think technology is a tool. It's not a thing by itself that is, attacking us.
Yeah. Yeah, and what man, nobody wants to be in the matrix, right? Like everybody wants to believe that well, I'm going to escape the matrix. I'm not going to be the one that's in the matrix. But when you really ask yourself the question of what that means, I think you'll find that it's not as simple as being knowledgeable or bathed in the light of some higher truth. It's about actually transcending to a level of severe egoic discomfort, right? Because you like, if you really don't want to be in the matrix, well, guess what the very first most powerful element of the matrix is? It's your own perception of yourself and all of the things that are appear to be good or bad for you from your unique POV as a being operated by an ego, or trying to use an ego to navigate this macro, all these macro happenings that you're talking about. And it seems more like what people mean by they don't want to be in the matrix is that they want some version of reality that their ego can rule over or understand better. Or we started kind of hinting at this in our last conversation, where people start to use some of these principles to be like as materialistic tools or something, as a way to, instead of really trying to understand this message of unity, this message of transcendence, this message of interconnection, they are trying to use that terminology, those rules, those games, to essentially elevate their ego using spiritual mythopoetic language. And
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I think there's three ways to go through life. I make this really simple, how I understand the world. The first way is to say, life happens to me.
yeah,
That is like, the matrix is out to get me, corporations are doing this to me, 5G is going to kill me, and vaccines are going to, all of that sort of, like, things are happening to me. I'm a victim of the man, right? Others are controlling me. That's a victim mentality. A lot of people live there. My parents did this to me. If that one had only been nicer to me, all of those things. That's the first way. Life happens to me. The second way is to say, I make life happen. It's all up to me. That's just as much pushback against the matrix, because the matrix isn't going to get me. I'm going to make things happen. I'm in charge, right? So it's all about me. Take your gun and go west, young man. Actually a very American idea. And I can say
yeah,
that because I grew up in Europe. Manifest destinies. No, it's you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, do your own thing. It's up to you. Anyone can become president. These ideas are very much ego driven. That's ego. The first one is victim. Second one is ego. It's up to me. I have to do it. It's all the power is in me. Activate the power in you. That whole new age stuff is all, yeah, very suspect from my perspective. But yes, that's the second way. And the third way is how I try to live, and I certainly fall into the first two at times. But that is saying the universe is already happening. It's already unfolding, as other cultures might call it. My job is to recognize and to read what's happening, and then to co-create with all the possibilities that come up with what's being created by the universe unfolding. That's a completely different perspective. So that involves two skill sets. First, I have to know what's happening, and not literally by joining something, but by figuring out what is the story that's unraveling, what are the potentials that are being presented to me. So what is happening? I have to be able to read that. For me, I use astrology to read what's happening in real time. There are other tools. Meditation, ayahuasca is really popular now. Psilocybin is coming in to do the same exact thing, to start to read, well, coming in again, I should say, into a broader
Yeah.
culture, to be able to read what the universe is already doing and what's already happening. So once I can read that, understand that, I'm making meaning of what's happening. Now I can co-create with that. What do I want to participate in? What do I want to contribute to that? That to me is how I try to live. But it requires being able to be tuned in and not thinking I'm going to make the world happen the way I want it based on some imagery that I have in my head, or everyone else is in charge of my life. I'm just a cork bobbing around on an ocean.
Right. Right. And that's so important because, I mean, to use another, probably overused analogy, when you escape Plato's cave, you think you're going to be, like to the person in the cave, they can't imagine what's outside the cave. So let's say you're that person, you're the Neo that gets outside the cave. Oh shit, there's a sun.
Mm-hmm.
Now you don't understand. Do you understand the sun because you escaped from the cave? It's like it's a continual climb that does not end, and maybe you get a bigger, more broad view of how things exist, how they connect, but you're never done. And that's the sort of trickstery paradox of trying to honestly reach some level of understanding. And that's why models like individuation and understanding the world archetypally rather than like linearly makes so much more sense because it's never linear. You change vantage points and you've gained some wisdom, but now you've got to recontextualize that wisdom in light of everything that you now know and that you don't know that you didn't know before. It's like it's a constant balancing act, a constant act of trying to contextualize and adjust. And anything less, I think, is requires some kind of dogma or requires some kind of fairy tale that is really just limiting you, or to use Robert Anton Wilson terminology, like putting you in a new reality tunnel. And you're not really after truth, then you're after comfort or community or something, but it's not truth.
Right, and we're right back into the tree. You've just jumped into a
Yeah.
different tree, and then you think you have the truth. And I don't have a problem with people being in a tree. I'm in a tree. I get it. Um, I am, but I'm aware that I'm in a tree, and I'm aware of what the limitations are and what the gifts are that come with the tree. Most people never think about the fact that in the tree, they think that they're in the tree and their tree is the right tree, and everyone else is in the wrong tree, and therefore they have to do something about it often, or they just avoid them, and that's what we call being in our bubble or our tunnel,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's not productive to solve the problems of the world.
yeah. Let's explain the tree because we brought it up and it's a fairly famous riff of your father's, but maybe we didn't do
Well,
a
why
good
don't
enough
you tell
job.
me what you get out of it, and I'll see if I
Oh
agree.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the idea is if you're in your tree philosophically speaking, take note of what branch you're on and what other branches seem close to your branch. So for me, here I am, here's Laurence Hillman, here's James Hillman, here's Jung, here's Plato, here's these kind of mythopoetic thinkers that inspire me and fill me with curiosity and the stuff of life, and that's where I am. I'm or you could use a planetary analogy, like this is orbiting this, and I fit right in this little solar system. And over there, we've got all these like way on the other end of the tree, perhaps, or in a different tree completely. We've got the super in the weeds analytical types that are you know measuring. I don't even know, do trying to play with numbers on a computer all day, and they're getting immense enjoyment and purpose out of that activity.
Mhm.
But
Right, I agree. I mean, it's just like it's that your tree has certain perspective. You can see certain things from that tree, and there are people on on similar branches for sure. And but that it's just a tree. It's not the truth. To me, the truth is the most dangerous word in the English language because I can talk about approaching the truth and being interested in the truth, but anyone who tells me they have it, I run away as fast as I possibly can because no one has the truth. Everyone has perspectives of the truth, and the more comprehensive that perspective is. So I ask myself sometimes, if you want to get into a philosophical argument with a left brainer, then to me the conversation is as such. Let's just look at quality of life. Would you rather have a life that includes the things that you can't measure, like, I don't know, love, or do you want to just say, well, love is just a matter of firing neurons in your brain? Fine. Which life would I rather have? A life that tells me that love is neurons firing in my brain, it's just chemicals that are going on between me and another person. And so, and rationalize it down to that? Or do I want to have the experience of, heart palpitations and getting red in the face and swooning and not being able to sleep? And do I want rather have that? It's not right or wrong, but they're very clear choices. So how we go about it is going to matter. How do we want to explain the inexplainable? And to me, it's more a psychological question also. It's like, what is, because I know that this person has the lover within them, because I know astrologists, I know that archetype is fully present. What happened to that figure? Why is that figure so pushed away, or so don't want to go there, or so we have to hang on to this because that's so safe? That's a more interesting question to me, psychologically, what's going on in a person, rather than just getting into an argument about who's right and who's wrong. It's not the point. It's
Yeah.
a way of thinking. It's like those two young girls watching that play.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Why should they argue about who's right about the play? It ruins the worldview for both of them. They just have to be aware of the limitations. The one will never know the story, and the other one really will never know the mechanics of it, which could be very, very thrilling and exciting for the first girl.
Yes. Yeah, really really well put. Really well put. One of the things, since you are, so steeped in astrology, and that's really been a central passion of yours for so long, people who have played around on the surface of the idea, or on the surface of that art, what do you think some of the most, I mean, there's one misconception or limitation, I think, that most people who are vaguely aware of their own chart, often, I don't know if it's a mistake necessarily, but it's a where they stop is, they might just say, I'm a this sun sign.
Hmm.
And I know for somebody like you, that's, I think you said this to me privately at some point, that that's like, I don't remember what you said. You said saying I'm a Pisces is like nothing
No,
essentially.
it's like saying I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert. Is the world
Right.
really about two kinds of people? And yet that's an extremely common term. It's a shorthand for something. And Pisces, when people say I'm a Pisces, they want to say something about it. That to me is like telling me you're 6 foot tall. It
Right.
says certain things about you, but it certainly doesn't describe you. And I certainly wouldn't want to make any kinds of decisions about you or any kinds of comfort level about you or anything else without having a much more complex picture about you than putting you in a label. Of course, there's not 12 kinds of people, but it's shorthand that has value because it means something deeper. It's like, complexity is difficult and we all try to simplify. So we come up with these things, Latin lovers, and all Italians are romantic, or all French, in Paris is the city of love, and so all Parisians are, these kinds of things. But most of those stereotypes are actually very negative. And we live in a time where those stereotypes are really no longer. I just gave you a couple of positives. There's plenty of bad ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so astrology is kind of the same thing. All Pisces are dreamers and can't get it together, and all Scorpios are oversexed. This kind of stuff is just stupid, but it's entertainment, which is what sun sign astrology, in the back of a magazine is. It's entertainment. I read them. Every astrologer I know reads them. Of course, it's fun. I like to be entertained, but it's not astrology.
Mm.
Not astrology the way I practice it. The difference between, imagine going to therapy for 6 months and someone saying you're an introvert. That's the
Right.
difference between
Yeah.
real astrology and sun sign astrology, right? And
Yeah.
so, what would you get out of 6 months of therapy? You'd know a whole lot about yourself on the deepest levels, about your patterns, about your history, about the whole complexity of what made you you today. And that's has way more value than saying, you're an introvert, you're an extrovert, which is just, a label. Again, we're getting away from a time of labels. And so people now are getting a little bit more sophisticated. So they know their sun sign and their moon sign and their ascendant. So that's a little bit richer already, but it's still
Yeah.
not the full picture that you can get when you have all 10. It's
Yeah.
just it's just a play that's, I think of the inner life of our inner psyche, of what's going on within us as a theater, as a play, where the planets slash actors slash parts of us are alive and well. They're all actors on this inner stage, and they can step forward. So if you're in a dark alley and somebody jumps out and says, "Give me your wallet," and sticks a knife out at you, you're not going to think about stepping into your warrior. That's going to be survival. That's instinctual. You're going to do whatever your warrior does. Now, there's different kinds of warriors. One warrior may say, "Oh, really? You want my money? Why don't you come and get it?" Another type would turn around and run as fast as you can. Another type would start screaming. So, but they're all warrior. The archetypal eye recognizes the warrior there, but these are three different kinds of warriors. Gets more sophisticated as we look deeper into the chart.
Mm.
What kind of way would you respond to something like that? So that's also automatic. But you can also choose. You can say, "I'm going into a meeting right now, and I know everyone's against my idea, but it's really important because I see the vision for the company. I'm a leader, or I'm anybody in the company, and I need to make my statement. I need to stand there in a warrior-like way. I need to access this part of myself that I know I have available, but I need to make sure that it's present when I make my presentation, that I don't come across as geeky or weak or unsure or something like that."
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can access these parts. And by the way, we think like that. How many times have you said, part of me wants to do this, another part of me wants to do that? We think in multiplicity. We don't think
Yes.
of ourselves as a singular I. We
Right.
think that we have these different roles, and we step into them. We have inner conversations. It's a mess in there at times. I could do this, I could do that, I could, all of this stuff. And I'm just giving those voices a a description, an embodiment, so that we can work with them and play with them by thinking of them as a stage.
Very
And I
interesting.
know where they are and who they are by looking at the sky that was above you, where I, by the way, see the planets in the sky as actors on a giant stage. It's just a bit unwieldy. So if we drop them in onto your inner stage at that moment of birth, we get this play that we can play with, and a story that we can read, just like we read that sheet music that we just found of Beethoven.
Yeah. 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 That makes perfect sense. And I was loading up a question that you actually partially already answered. But and by the way, I made a connection. Have you ever heard of it's a newer, I guess, type or technique in psychology by Dick Schwartz. It's called parts work or
Yeah.
parts. It sounds so much like
Yeah,
what you're
no, there's
saying,
yeah,
except
there's that.
they're not using astrological
Right,
terminology.
and I have right. There's internal family systems is very
Yes, yes,
similar.
that's what I
Right,
meant. Yeah,
right, and I have an issue with that for some reasons, because some of the names are really negative names. Like there's a lot of that, and there's characters, there's parts that are not good parts that we have to we have to address and 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 see. I just don't think of archetypes as being good or bad. I think of them as characters. Energy is nothing until directed. So what
hmm
we do with it is what matters. And so I don't think that there's a bad part of me, or that there are bad charts, or that there's those. I don't think of those
mm.
terms. I wonder what happened to parts when they appear as being unfriendly and difficult for us, and then I want to know how else could we live them. That's the therapeutic process.
Yeah. I talked to Dick a while back. I think he would agree. Like he seemed very more interested in trying to take parts that feel negative or exiled and bring them back into a more
Hmm.
positive familial dynamic. But I also see your point. And I also think too, like it could almost benefit from using more archetypal, more, and they may. I've admittedly I've not been
Hmm.
deeply schooled in this, but it seems like they could use archetypal language a little more readily, because that would really help people understand, like, you've got this rebellious part, you've got
Right,
this
right. And
sovereign part.
right there, Michael, you're talking to the core and the key of the archetypal model, because it's easy to see that we have all parts by just knowing we're all born under a sky and all the planets are there, right? So that's the easy sort of analogy. But if I know it's a different model, you see, I work in organizations, and just about everyone I've ever talked to who works in the company has had an assessment. They've been assessed, right? And almost all assessments, there's hundreds and hundreds of assessments out there.
Right.
And almost all assessments, let's take the most popular one, perhaps the most famous one based on Jung, interestingly, which is the Myers-Briggs. So Myers-Briggs essentially is a typology. There are 16 types, and you get this four-letter combination of who you are. So if you're an INTFJ, you're not in whatever, right? So a typology, by definition, is exclusionary, because if I'm over here in this type, I'm not those other 15. I'm making it very simple. I know it's more sophisticated than that, but this gives you an idea of typology versus archetypal thinking. And so I'm separated from that group. And it gets even worse when someone then says, well, INTFJs should only work in accounting, which does happen. It's horrible, but it does happen because that's the type of person who does best at accounting. Okay, that's one
Yeah.
way of thinking. The problem is that we live in a world, which you have just said again, and I said in the earlier, is that we don't want to be put into boxes. We don't want to be told I'm this and therefore I'm not that. However, someone who tells me I'm everything, but part of me isn't very comfortable to me because of nature and nurture. Maybe I was told that boys don't cry or girls don't get aggressive or whatever the stories were that we were told culturally and in our particular families, allow us to repress certain archetypes, put them away, and others are encouraged. We're really good at those because, yes, boys do sports. And so my warrior is really strong, right? Because that's what I was told. And so we then also have cultural ideas that, good leaders are good warriors, because most leadership theory comes from World War II and people who came back who were put into business, had leadership experience in the military. So that's literally how leadership theory was built in the first time. It didn't exist really before. So this is a problem that we then face because we're looking at being separate from other people. The archetypal models say, no, actually, everyone is everything. What would it behoove you to develop right now because it's not there strong enough? And you could also have someone again, it's theater metaphor. You could have three actors on the center of the stage that are always running the show. They're always center stage. That could become boring because you got seven other ones that are sitting out, and eventually could get boring. Probably that's how people recognize you most, for those three, in a combination in your life, or three or four or something like that. But then what about the other ones? You have all these other talents that you don't really access because you're told you're not supposed to, or you just don't know how, or whatever. So all of that becomes an interesting developmental fun play to step into these parts of us that we don't otherwise access easily.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And I think even if you dive further into a lot of those other assessments, it's like they're telling you that you are partially all of these different things, but they greatly disemphasize the things. Well, you're less this and you're more this, so therefore you're this. It's sort of the way that you leave feeling
I don't
taking
think
those
that's
tests.
totally true. I think if you're of course, if you are this, people walk away with that, with a label on their forehead. This is who I
Yeah,
am. And those other things aren't really, they may show up as, far, far away, but it's not in the model. It's not included as part of the core idea, because
right.
it's like, you don't do this. If it's a circle thing, it's like, this is like gone, it's not there. And so I think it's really important to embrace the fact that an archetypal model says, actually, we all have everything.
If people wanted to go a layer deeper with kind of understanding their natal astrological situation beyond, okay, I know my sun sign, but then after that everything gets foggy. Where do you encourage people to look next, and how do you start to like weigh the things beyond that, if that's possible?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it matters who you talk to. So I suggest they find somebody they trust. And that would mean mostly word of mouth, or someone they've heard somewhere, or something where they feel comfortable with that person, because there's a lot of garbage out there. Just like there's a lot of really bad therapists out there, and there's a lot of really bad doctors out there, unfortunately. Every profession has less and better people. It's just human nature. And there are a lot of really good astrologers out there. What I would do is I would go to
Mm.
astrologyuniversity.com. I think it's .com or .org, but Astrology University, a friend of mine runs it. I think he has the best teachers in the world. I don't know if I should say that because I'm also one of his teachers, but I think he has amazing people. He's doing an extraordinary job. You can go there and just browse around and find a lecture that interests you. And some of them I think, are marked as beginners or whatever else. Just get a sense of, listen to other people talk. Don't take my word for it. Listen to other people talk about this language, talk in this language, and see what they're doing with it and how it might resonate with you. So dip your feet in a little bit deeper. Um, and you might say, I really like what this, and you can go anywhere from just that to, studying with him for 4 years and getting
Wow.
a certificate of, as an astrologer. So there's real programs out there now to learn this stuff again. It's a complex language and it takes some patience to learn it. Don't do it overnight. So it's also good to be guided by someone who has done it for a while. That's the number one thing I would look for. Someone who's been doing it, who's been practicing, not just thinking about it, but has been practicing or has been published or has been out there and has really given it a big chunk of their own time and life investment. So it's somebody who's not just doing it on the side or doing, somebody's really serious about it, and who you like their style, and then get a reading from them. I really think that getting a reading is the only way to have a real experience of it. Sure, you can go to Astrodienst and print out your own chart, and you'll be looking at it the way someone who doesn't read sheet music looks at Beethoven's Fifth. It's just a whole bunch of lines and dots in a circle, and you might be able to find one little piece that gets dangerous because you might, to know just enough to be
Yeah.
dangerous, as they say, where you start to make assumptions about yourself that are not
Right.
psychologically framed. And so, to me, to really um, to what you're looking for in an astrologer, I sometimes sum up in five different things. The first thing is the technical knowledge. That's simply, I know what this means, and I know, I'm not what this means, but I know what the difference between the Mars and
Right.
Venus. I mean, simple stuff like that. That's the technical. It's a language. You have to learn the language. That takes some time, just like learning any language. So you start to speak differently. Have you ever heard two astrologers talk? They're talking in different language. They're talking in jargon. Because when they say, yeah, my moon is in Pisces squaring my, Saturn in Sagittarius, and someone will go, huh? But that means something specifically. Right there for that little story, I get an image, right? And then you combine that with the rest, and you can go on for hours like that. It's shorthand because it's a language. So that's the first skill, is learn the language. Second skill, be able to translate that language into psychological patterns. That's a
Mm.
completely different skill set. You can have really good technical people who have no psychology, who don't understand what it means to have Saturn moon in a person, how that might manifest psychologically, not just what it means from a textbook. The third thing, and then also how to talk to someone psychologically. The third thing is the communication. How do you tell that psychological story that you now know to a person? Communication skills. Oh, you have a mother complex. No, you don't say that, even if you understand the psychology of it, right? So that's a whole other skill set. You have people who are really good technically, really good psychologically, but they can't explain it. They can't talk to other people about it. You have people who are really good technically and really bad psychologically and really good at talking about it, and they're just talking jargon and nobody understands what that means, and so on. The fourth thing is life experience. The more you've fallen on your own face and scratched your knees, the better. The more you have experiences you can relate to real people through, the better. I mean, this is the classic story of architects who don't cook, who design kitchens. It's just like, if you don't have a sense of what you're doing, of what you're talking about personally from personal experience. Therefore, the older you are, the more you've experienced, the more life you've lived. That doesn't necessarily mean age, but the more life you've lived, um, the more the more valuable, I think. And the third and the fifth thing is, be professional. So are they professional? Do they show up on time? Do they handle it properly? I know of a case, someone once told me they were having a reading, and they could hear, the person using a nail file in the background. That's just not professional. So it's those little things. So show up, lift up the profession of astrologer, by being lift up everybody by being doing it professionally. So those 5 things, if you find that in somebody and you can gauge that with your own depth of knowledge of human beings, then I think you found somebody where you have
Yeah, that's
a
a great
good skill
answer.
set. But it
Yeah,
takes
that's a
those
great
five
answer. And
things.
it's
So that's what I would look for. So I would look for, if you want to know more about yourself and about your deeper chart and use that pathway to understand yourself better. Again, there are others, but if you want to use this one, it is a really good X-ray. Then I would start at Astrology University and start to listen to other people and get a sense of what they're saying. Then go to their websites and see what they're doing and what their availability is and these kinds of things. But it gives you a sense of people who are really dedicated an intellectual mind to teaching and learning and passing it on and has their own style, which you can see by watching a
yeah, that's a
lecture.
great answer. That's a better answer than like look at this next or look at this in your chart next because it does it is difficult to know how to balance these things, to know how what it really means in relation to something else. And I mean, that's what really blew my mind in the reading that you did for me, which thank you again, by the way, for doing that, was just the interplay of everything and trying to understand how to weight everything. It's so much more complicated. There's such a story.
Yeah, I think the personal experience is the thing, and finding someone you're comfortable with. There's not a right way to, I remember famously Liz Green, one of the greatest astrologers ever, also a Jungian. I remember in a book, somebody asked her something. She had a lot of her lectures transcribed, and I remember in a book she says, somebody asks her, "So tell me, what is I have this and this and this? What does it mean?" And she said, "It means absolutely
Mm.
nothing without the whole chart. So just because you have the moon in Pisces doesn't mean anything, unless I know the context of the whole story. The art is the synthesis of the whole picture, keeping the whole thing in mind. If you're a conductor and you've got, all of Beethoven's Fifth, it's not about getting that drummer to play exactly right. It's about getting that drummer on those big drums to do things in context to the violin and to the recorder and to the flutes and to all these different, I don't know if there's a recorder, but whatever the instruments are, to put them in context to the whole music. That's the art. That's why it's an art more than a science. The science part is figuring out where the planets are at any given time. That's math, but computers do that now. And so having an understanding of the meaning making from a story, that's an art, and that's something that a
Mm.
good astrologer
Great
can do.
answer. Yeah. If people want, so this is another thing that's, I've got to ask you. If people want to, they feel pulled toward this more archetypal, mythopoetic way of seeing, but they just don't, they feel ill equipped. They're not sure how to develop this way of seeing. And this is me to an extent too. And now even just turning the question back around on myself, it's kind of a hard question to answer because I feel like over the last decade and a half or so, I've really had to kind of just go out there and search and comb through the bullshit to find the jewels, like to come. It's like, okay, so we have Jung and I can go a mile deep through his collected works if I want to. Is it approachable? Not really. Like that in and of
No,
itself is like you almost need some priming to get into Jung. I think I would actually encourage people to read Soul's Code by your father because he does a great job of contextualizing. Here's the way we're thinking about the world these days. Here's what we're losing. Here are some mythological examples from Plato, from the Greeks. Here are some real life examples of exactly what I'm talking about and that you're trying to fit um, a, a square peg in a round hole. And that's why this person struggled. And then as soon as they got into this environment, they thrived. And I think that's a really
I agree,
useful.
and that's the daimon story and the idea
Yes,
of the
yes.
inner core and the life purpose. Yes, very very good idea. I would also recommend, if you want to start developing the archetypal eye, then, and seeing sort of the practicality of this, as you're saying, I'm hearing that's where you're going. Then I would put a plug in for my own book, which is the Planets in Play book. Planets in Play, how to align your no, that's like Planets in Play. I don't remember what the subtitle is. There might not be one, but the Planets in Play. Oh, reimagining your life through the language of astrology. And so that is very, it's a very practical book. So it goes into each of the 10 and tells you very clearly in different, very differing scenarios how they show up in your life. So you can start to develop that archetypal eye. That's how I would go about it. I wrote it on purpose for that, for beginners, and as a sort of as a book reference you can keep on your desk to when you something happens. Now, how would I translate that into archetypes? That process, which is a great way to start because it becomes natural. You start to see it as you learn the language. But actually, I thought I knew where your question was going, and I was going to answer you by reading poetry.
That's a good answer too. Yeah.
Rilke. I would read Rilke. You
Yeah.
know, it's so incredibly archetypally and beautiful. So I would read poetry, and I would read Hafitz, and I would read, I would read these kind of things. And the classics is another good way to get in. Just read stories, read mythology, read. It's called mythopoetic for a reason. It's
Yeah.
poetry and mythology. So yeah, that's where I would go, because it's an indirect way to develop that muscle in your mind, as opposed to learning all the theories and filling your head up with what other people have interpreted certain things to mean.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
We
And
don't
also,
want to make it another literal language. It is not literal. It is, you bring to the table your own archetypal story that will read the play that is you and that is other people differently than I will read it, which makes it more interesting and more beautiful. And then we can start to find what we all share, which is the underlying archetypes, even though we see the literal image differently.
yeah.
If I say tree and you say tree, Michael, we're both thinking of a tree, but your tree is different from my tree, but we agree on what treeness is. We agree on the archetype of the tree.
Yeah. Do you think, in a sort of platonic sense, or maybe I'm phrasing this in a way that's way too suggestive, but do you think that that's because that there is some underlying truth? Like, I guess I was asking you this in the beginning as well, so maybe it's appropriate that we come full circle. Do you think it's because there is some truth of what treeness is that exists in an almost platonic kind of
Yes,
transcendent way? Okay.
absolutely. I believe those animals walking on the wall behind me are real. So, yes, I believe there is such a thing. And that is why I have used a very scientific word called, the genome, the human genome of the soul. I think they really are the building blocks of the human soul, and they're universal, and every culture and every person has always throughout history expressed them in some way, shape, or form. And
Mm,
that gets really interesting to me, because now I can be curious about the different forms that they take. It's like being if we say there's a person standing inside an outfit, I could be interested. If I'm interested in fashion, I can go all around the world and see how different people stand, but there's always a person in the middle. It's always an outfit, but they can take on all kinds of forms, you know, from a bikini to, a toga. Very
yeah.
different, and it gives you completely different cultural context, everything else, but it dresses up the archetype, and makes it palatable for me, because I'm studying and I'm interested in outfits and how do people do outfits differently. You can do the same thing for house, or for what is a suite, or what is money, or what is valuable, or what is love, and all these things. You can take any concept, any word, and start looking at it through this multicultural global lens, which is very popular today. So that's why I think astrology is getting such a renaissance, because it is a universal language. Everyone is born under a sky.
Hmm. Yeah. Speaking of genealogy, and not just, I guess, not just literally, though the literal aspect of this, there will be a literal aspect to this question, I guess. When you look back at your own curiosity and your own interest on some of these topics, do you think you would have had those interests if you weren't part of the family you were part of? Or do you think because you saw these things at an early age, that opened a door? Because from personally speaking, I had no familial example of really mythopoetic p- thinkers. Like, I was just curious. I was always asking questions. I was always wondering why people wanted to do this job or go to this church and didn't make sense to me. And I just wound up there. But
It's a great
yeah.
question. It's a great question. So I think it's definitely, for me, I'm very clear on this, that it's a flat out combination of nurture and nature. So I think definitely, as someone once said about me, I was marinated in archetypal thinking as a
Hmm.
child, of course. And that gave me great advantages and an ease with that. And you can see lots of cases where musicians' children become great musicians and doctors' kids become great doctors and so on. But that can also be a very dangerous assumption
Yeah.
because, that's the one where it says, hey, grandpa was a doctor and I'm a doctor. And by gosh, you're going to be a doctor because that's what we do in this family. That could be very dangerous. So it's both. Now, the nature part in my case, just like you didn't have any access to depth psychology, maybe, or archetypal thinking, I had absolutely zero exposure to any kind of technology. Both my parents, I mean, it was
Mm.
before that time. They were completely, not interested in technology. We were as backwards in technology you could be in the 60s and 70s in Switzerland, where I grew up. Computers didn't exist. You know, Everything was mythopoetic and it wasn't, it was natural and things like that. And we didn't have a television in my house, none of that, things like that. Well, I happen to love to program. I love technology. I taught all that myself. Nobody showed me
Mm.
how to do that. That's stuff that I have natural talents for. So I believe it's a mixture of nature and nurture. So nurturing and understanding what's there already, it's a combination. And so we need to take history into consideration. It's certainly part of it. But one of the cool things about astrology is you don't need to do, I've often said tongue in cheek that getting a good reading is like going to therapy for 6 months. And then I have people poo poo it and yeah, right. And, I have tons of therapists and also lots of psychiatrists as clients. And once they get a reading, they'll say, well, you're right, because they've had the experience. You don't need the whole history that you often spend a lot of time with in therapy. You can see things and patterns and where people are right now. And sometimes it's important to go back into the history. But again, we're not into blame psychology. We're interested, how did you get here? And what are you doing with that right now? And how do you want to go forward? Do you want to spend, all this time going back and not living in the
Yeah.
moment? Or do you want to spend this time actually understanding your potentials and doing something with them and trying something you might not have, that you might have great talent with because you've never seen it? No one has ever pointed it out to you.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
different way to go forward. And time is short. You notice that when you get older, but also you notice that when you look around, that the time is running out in a lot of places, which is why I work more with organizations where there's more power. Because to me, like, if I want to make a difference, if I can leverage this work in an organization with 10,000 people, I don't have to talk to 10,000 people. I can talk to the leadership. And that to me is worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that's the double-edged sword in a good way of hierarchy is it gives you access to a large number of people if you can get in from the top and you can proliferate that down. But that point you made about not spending too much time looking backwards, dealing with where you are now and figuring out how to move forward from that. That's another thing that I definitely got a lot from reading your father is that psychology does not have to be reverse engineering every goddamn micro trauma that's ever happened to you in your life, and you don't like lettuce because your mom spanked you wearing a green dress or something, like just these small tiny things. And it seems a lot like, as a person who's not a professional but has an interest in psychology, it seems like that's what psychology can become, is going through every nook and cranny of potential trauma and everything that ever happened to you, rather than dealing with how can we move forward, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, let's use those to look forward, not backward.
Right.
um
Well, psychology has been hijacked in a way by developmental models,
yeah.
that you have to advance, you have to be here, you have these stages and you get better. It's very, very hierarchical, it's very top down, and you're trying to get to these, most developmental models are quite linear and quite masculine in that sense, that you get better the higher up you get, you know, then you're more developed. Well, I don't see it that way. I combine developmental thinking and archetypal thinking and say we have all these different parts. Each one of them is developed at different levels, which very quickly and easily explains why you have the genius professor who can't put on two matching socks, because that part is not as developed as this part. It's kind of like, we don't have to throw out developmental thinking. Of course, we all go from sitting to crawling to walking, to running. Of course, that there's a natural human development, but we can't think of ourselves as being singular. We can't think of ourselves as being this one thing that develops. There's these different parts that develop at different speeds, and some of them sometimes get pushed away. And so, again, in the theater metaphor, some of them are benched. And there's usually a cost to people when an archetype is benched. If you're a leader and your inner nurturer, the part of you that cares about people and is emotionally available and close, is totally benched because you were always told that, real men don't have feelings, and because, you have to be the first and beat the competition. It's a jungle out there. If that's your belief system, and that's how you go at it, and your nurture is benched, you might have a really high turnover because nobody feels like they're part of the family. Nobody is feels like they belong there, or that they have anything they're contributing, except they're part of their machine in the cog. How many people do we know who feel that way about work? So as a leader, if you can develop that nurturing side of yourself, which is there by definition of the model, now you can actually develop something. You can lower your costs because people start to feel, the turnover cost goes way down. It's very expensive to lose someone and have to hire someone else. Plus you can't find anybody. So it's important to keep the people that you have that are good. So it's a simple, leadership problem.
All right, the techno trickster has decided to show its face, so we're dealing with a hard restart. But I believe where we left off was you were starting to talk about the importance of the ability to really try to get this archetypal thinking, I guess, back into the zeitgeist by introducing it at the top of corporations, which is very interesting, and I think very, very genius and practical.
Well, I sat back one day and I thought, I have a daughter who's almost 30, and, the world is falling apart, and I have responsibility as slowly becoming an older person, to take some responsibility for my part in creating what's happening. And I thought, how can I make a difference? How can I do something about it? And it's happening very quickly, and I want to give something back to a larger amount of people. And I thought, well, where is the power? If you want to make a difference, speak to power. And I thought, well, politicians don't really have power. They are controlled pretty much by their constituents that they get paid by. So it's a strange system that we have. So I thought, well, the real power is with where the money is, and the money is with corporations, with organizations. And I also, at the same time, this intermingled with the fact that a lot of corporations are looking for new ways to do things that they've done a certain way for a long time that is no longer working, such as, the example I gave before about, leading in a top-down model when we're really in a matrix, and what is that, or in a three-dimensional network, and what does that really look like? So um, there are a lot of questions. I have a belief that 80% of companies won't get it in my lifetime. Some of them are too big to fail. Some of them are just have enough power and money to just push through the old ways. They're not really adapting. They're too big to really change, and they'll either do, or they will just, drop out of the picture, which surprisingly many companies are doing so quickly that we're, fail safe.
Yeah.
Banks now, but other retail stores, just like, it's amazing how many big chains have just, that were big, successful, and powerful, have just collapsed in the 40 years that I've lived in this country. And then you have, so those are not going to be interested in the work that I do. 10%, this is just a rough number that I use. 10%, I think, already get it. They have figured out the new models. They're doing things very, very differently. Ubers, the Airbnbs, the networking sort of models, the people working for themselves in larger systems, and so forth. There's pros and cons to everything, of course, and we're just trying out new things. But it's a completely different business model to what we had before. And at the same time, you have, that leaves us with 10% to me that are knowing they need to do something, but they don't know what. And those are the 10% that I'm really interested to talk to. So if I go to a party, I figure there'll be one person out of 10 at that party, if they're all in, doing business of some kind, who wants to talk to me and who's interested in what I'm doing. And those are the ones I want to focus on. I don't want to waste my time with the other 90%.
Yeah.
And because that's just, barking up a wall or so. So if we find those people who are open and interested in doing something differently, we can say, well, guess what? We have a model. You're recognizing you need to do something. We have a model where we can go in and we can actually help you in your leadership. And the reason, I'm very aware that most companies are still in a pyramid model, Very, very few are operating in what's called a heterarchy, where there's sort of equal power. I mean, those are small groups. Usually, once you get into more than 100 people, you start to have hierarchies of some kind. But it doesn't have to be hierarchies of power. It can be hierarchies. It can be groups that work. There are interesting new leadership models out there. But
Yeah.
that's the second conversation. Right now, what interests me is to think about leverage. So if we really want to make a difference, if leadership buys into a new idea, it's much easier to disseminate that because of the power structure. So we can use the power structure as an advantage to actually get more work disseminated quicker. And so once leadership understands the power of this kind of language and understands that they can address things like, feeling disenfranchised from their work. 70% of Americans I read recently, want a new job. I mean, that's extraordinary. The cost of that to organizations is incredible, not just to big ones, but to small ones as well. So why are people so unhappy? What are we doing wrong? Why aren't people doing their passionate work and so on? So these real deep questions are so strong. I know you were once in a corporate setting, and so
Yeah.
you changed your life. So this is a extremely common problem today. We have to address that. We can by giving people a sense of meaning. But young people are coming in and they're saying, what are you guys making? I don't want to just be making widgets. I want to have a meaningful connection to the product that we're making or to the service that we're providing. Otherwise, I'm just doing my job and people don't want that anymore. And that's a huge shift in awareness of people. So we can address that by, again, making people understand the archetypal value of what is being done in this organization. And then it doesn't matter if it's for profit, nonprofit, size, none of that matters. But what is the archetypal story that is being told here? And does that archetypal story, am I in agreement? Am I comfortable? Am I good with that archetypal story? That's the first thing we can do. We can also, so we can help find what the archetypal story is that's being told, but we can also develop people. So let's say you have an R&D team, right? And leadership one day looks at the numbers and says, you know what, we've given them, um, millions of dollars over the last 5 years. They've never really come up with anything new. That's what R&D is supposed to do. What's going on here? So they call us in. They're thinking of shutting it down, but you have to do R&D, and but they've really not come up with anything interesting. So what's going on here? There's 30 people working there. So we come in, we do an assessment. We have our own archetypal assessment that isn't typology,
Yeah.
that tells you where you are in the developmental place right now at this moment, and what you might want to develop. And last week, last year, it might have been different because you were in a different place in your life. So we understand that people change. And so we give an assessment of this team, and we might find that none of them have the renegade, which is the part that invents, the part of us that is inventive and thinks outside of the box, very, very well developed or very comfortable with it. That could be for different reasons. It could be because they're afraid if they step out of line, they're going to get fired. For what doesn't matter what the reasoning is. We don't have to go into the history. Same thing. We just recognize right now the renegade is not very present in this team. And we know we need more renegades. So we go in and we do a renegade workshop for them.
Mm.
And we teach them to activate that part of them, which is
Yeah.
different than a model that says, you know what, you're the wrong people here because you don't have that part. You're of this type. You're not of that type. You're not the creative type. We need creative types in here. We don't say that. We say, actually, all we have to do is activate the renegade, which isn't that easy because you have to overcome certain things, but
Yeah.
you can do that and you can keep your people. So
Yeah.
it's a big difference in model, and that is very exciting to leadership, and then see what they develop. We can also help them, just work with them. We can also do coaching with just the leader of that team, so that they become more comfortable with their inner renegade, because that's the part we need. It might be a combo of renegade and storyteller. Once you invent the good stuff, how do you tell the story to those who need to make the decisions on financing and things like that? So we teach different skill sets that are already in people, but specifically for corporations. So it's a language called Archetypes at Work. There's a book out. There's a website, archetypesatwork.com. We also train people in this model. So we train coaches and consultants and HR people in how to use this language. It's extremely effective and useful. We're doing this globally. I'm translating the work into 10 languages as we speak. It is a very exciting model that people like because it speaks to the person and what's already there. And people are seen, for the parts of them that they aren't usually seen.
Yeah, it's
I've done these debriefs for these assessments for people all over the world. And, people say, I've never been seen or talked to like that in a corporate setting. And that's very refreshing. It's literally ensouling the workplace.
yeah, I love that. I love that mission and the product, if you want to call it a product, which I'm sure you have some, probably not your favorite word for it, but
It's a language. I like to think of
yeah,
it as a language.
yeah,
The other part
it's
of it, just can I just
of
sorry, but I
course,
just
yeah.
want to finish one thing that is really
Hmm.
important is that unlike a lot of other languages out there, it is an embodied language. My partner in this, Richard Olivier, is a theater director and comes from a theater family in London and is, incredibly skilled and has developed this language called mythodrama, which is an embodied way of telling a story and of doing leadership. And so our language, this archetypes at work language, is an embodied language. How do you step into that warrior when you step into that? And that's based on all kinds of techniques that he has developed over the years. So we train people very deeply. It's really in your body. It's not just something in your head.
Yeah, and that's another thing you don't get through these other models is like,
Mhm.
along with the recognition of and the issue that comes with leaving thinking I'm a this in a Myers-Briggs sense, or even worse, like disc that breaks you down into like one of four, like I'm a this, and
Mhm.
like not only are you not leaving with that kind of a sort of limiting view of yourself, you're also taking it to that other level of embodiment that you're talking about. So it's so you can wake that part of you up through actual actions. Even it's funny because even talking about, I guess we were talking about the renegade with respect to my reading the other day, but it's also really interesting. And I won't go off on a huge tangent here because this is a whole nother rabbit hole we could get into. But isn't it funny how everything starts from that renegade POV of doing something different, being a disruptor, but then eventually that calcifies into some rote way of doing the same thing over and over again. And then you're scared to wake the renegade back up because not only could the renegade innovate for you, well, they could also fuck everything up because they come in and they topple over the established order of things. But that's the magic, that's the fire you got to play
That's why
with.
we have other parts. That's why we have a
Yeah,
strategist who organizes everything and keeps everything in shape. So we don't want to just have the renegade run the show. We want to have a renegade,
right.
strategist combo. And that's why we develop different parts, and that's why we think of it as a multiplicity, not as a single character ever running anything. I just use that as an example.
Right,
But
right.
I'm fully aware that when I'm talking to those 30 people, there are lots of archetypes in the room. They also have a dreamer, they also have a lover, they have a nurturer, they have a sovereign, they have a renegade, and so on. So I'm just speaking to a particular part because that's the skill set that they need for that particular job that may not be active enough, and we can show that in the assessment and give some numbers to the number crunchers and say, look, we could work on this. They answered the questions like this. They don't feel about themselves to be very inventive.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I love that mission of re-insouling the workplace because my God, does the workplace feel soulless a lot of the time. Unless you happen to end up in some position where you really feel like it's speaking to your personal gifts and you as a full human being are integral to what you're doing. Man, that does not really harmonize with work in general, especially in our culture. So that's a very noble end.
But people were never asked
Yeah.
about that, and people never came to the workplace demanding that. It was sort of like, this is my 9 to 5, and then I go live my life. And that's no longer acceptable because people are not making that separation so much. They're saying, look, I've got this life, world is falling apart. What am I going to do when I do work to make a living, or because I'm passionate about it for whatever reason that I work? What I need to have more meaning in that decision of what I do. And you can't buy me and just tell me to shut up and give me $5,000 more a year and now I'll be quiet. It
Right.
doesn't work anymore with young people. And that's freaking leaders out
Yeah.
because they have to deal with, a leader once said to me, a CEO of some company said, this is the first time in history that a leader has to deal with 5 generations.
Whoa.
It's an interesting idea because you still have those greatest generation people who are coming in, who have certain belief systems, and then you have young people coming in out of high school. And if you don't have that skill set of knowing the difference in the mindsets in this rapidly evolving time, you're just a command and control person from the old days, and you're just in my way or the highway, and that doesn't work anymore because it's too expensive to fire people. So, and there's so many. If you Google leadership in Amazon, you get over 60,000 hits. It's a big topic, and most of them use the same, more of the same of the old models, just slight tweaks. There's all kinds of things like, leading from behind or gentle or soft skills and all these kind of things, but they're all missing the idea of singularity versus multiplicity. And the
Yeah.
multiplicity says you already have this stuff in you. It's a worldview. And again, astrology shows it most simply because we all have the same ingredients in the charts, just put together differently. That's really refreshing. And people really take to that because I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I might just not be very good at something, which I can then develop and ask myself how. And that
Yeah.
becomes a coaching journey with a coach or with someone who can help you.
Yeah. Really well put, Lawrence. I've really enjoyed this mind meld. I hope it's the first of many. Like I really, there's that feeling when you've had a really good one where it feels like hardly any time passed at all. And other than our technical hiccups, I felt like we were just completely in the flow throughout this conversation. So I really, really greatly enjoyed it. Something just came to me that I kind of want to throw you one final musing that I'd like to hear your riff on, if you'll indulge me.
Of course.
Um, it's a it's not quite a quote, but there's a quote somewhere that this thought is emanating from, and I think it was Jung. It may have actually been your father, but it's something to the effect of we're being lived by forces that we can't understand, or something to that effect. So to flesh out the question, do you think of it that way? Do you think of it as like archetypes are having us? Or do you think about it like us as having archetypes, or is that a false dichotomy?
No, I have a very clear line that people know me for decades that I use, which says, "You do the gods, or the gods do you."
Yeah.
And that pretty much says it for me. So the gods are planets, archetypes, inner figures, characters, parts of me, whatever you want to call them. They are going to have their way. You have a choice in how much you have a say in that.
Mm,
I'm very, very sure of that because otherwise, how could I look at so many charts where I don't know the person at all and immediately see their life in front of me? If they had that much choice and they weren't aware of it, then why would it unfold exactly as sort of planned? You only have choice, and it's also, you talked about choice before and free will. Jung said famously, freedom is to do gladly that which we must. So the archetypes
mm,
compel us to do certain things. It's like this is our nature. This is what we must do because it's in us. And the Soul's Code talks a lot about
yeah.
that. I must sing instead of dance. The Ella Fitzgerald story. So it's like this moment where this power comes up in us. That's the archetype speaking. I must do this because this is who I really am, and I'm stepping forward and I'm taking control now. And so I see it all the way like that. I see I have more. The more I know about my archetypes, the more I'm doing them and them not doing me.
Yeah. That makes sense. That there is some kind of reciprocal relationship that they in, like you said, we're doing each other, and that perhaps we're fulfilling some kind of function that they cannot experience without beings like us, in that they themselves are sort of these more fixed qualities, but then when they intermingle and express themselves through a human being or through a being, that maybe that kind of um what's the word I'm looking for, catharsis, is like part of how they actually live or express themselves or something.
That's a very, very old idea that's actually biblical. It's
Hmm.
possibly older. But the idea that, we need to find, source, whatever that is, God, the gods, whatever you want to call it, that we need to make that connection. That's the human longing for meaning making, to put it in perspective. And source, God, the gods, whatever else, need us to incarnate because otherwise, what's their point?
Right.
And so there is that, and that's the two triangles that push into each other, where you get the Star of David symbol. To me, that's
Ah,
also
okay.
as above, so below. Same idea.
Yeah.
pointing
Well
upwards
said.
and pointing downwards, So yeah, definitely. We need the gods and they need us. So it's a fun way. I just like to think that I'm playing with them all the time and not that I'm a victim of them or anything like that. Not at all. They're not mean. Again, energy is nothing until expressed. So they're
Mm.
just energies that want to be manifested in some way. So I have a choice.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, again, I've immensely enjoyed this.
Same
Um,
here. Thanks a
I'm
lot.
looking forward to hopefully doing it again. Please stay in touch, and
Absolutely.
I'm excited to put this one out.
Thanks. Take care.